When we talk about the Second World War and about the Jews, the first thing that comes to mind is the horror of the Holocaust. Millions of victims, concentration camps, and an extermination machine without precedent in history. But what if I told you that there is another part of history that is almost never told? Jews who fought with weapons in their hands against the Nazis, scientists who changed the course of the war, spies, partisans, soldiers, and communities that refused to surrender. A legacy of resistance, courage, and survival that was overshadowed under the shadow of tragedy. Today you will discover what you were never told about the Jews during the Second World War. What you were never told about the Jews during the Second World War. When we talk about the Second World War and about the Jewish people, the first thing that usually comes to mind is the Holocaust, the systematic persecution, the concentration camps, the ghettos, and the tragedy of 6 million lives taken away. However, to reduce the Jewish history of those years only to the condition of victims is to leave incomplete a fundamental part of what really happened. What is almost never told, or at least not with enough strength, is that the Jews were not only receivers of horror, but also protagonists of resistance, struggle, and reconstruction. There was a life before the disaster, with vibrant Jewish communities in Poland, Germany, Hungary, Romania, France, and other places in Europe, where schools, newspapers, synagogues, universities, and cultural movements flourished. That social and cultural richness was what Nazism tried to annihilate, not only with the physical death of millions of people, but also with the attempt to erase their roots and their memory. It is rarely told that thousands of Jews participated in armed resistance. From the ghettos of Warsaw, Vilna, and Białystok to the forests of Belarus and Ukraine, young people and adults organized guerrilla networks, sabotaged trains, destroyed ammunition depots, and rose up, even knowing that death was almost certain. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in 1943 is only one example, but there were dozens of centers of struggle that rarely appear in school accounts. It is also rarely remembered that hundreds of thousands of Jews fought in the Allied armies. 500,000 in the Red Army, more than 500,000 in the United States Army, other thousands in the British forces and in the French resistance. Among them were doctors, pilots, generals, and foot soldiers who fought not only for their countries, but for the very survival of their people. Some of them were present in the liberation of concentration camps, facing face-to-face what was left of their families. Another aspect, little told, is the role of the Jews after the war. While Europe was in ruins, many survivors began to rebuild their lives in displaced persons camps, small, temporary communities where teaching was carried out, weddings were celebrated, and children were born as an act of defiance against extermination. From those same survivors would arise the strength that later would drive the creation of the State of Israel in 1948, seen by many as the culmination of a long history of suffering, resistance, and hope. In addition, the Jewish legacy of the war is not only pain. The contribution of Jewish scientists, artists, and thinkers was essential for the Allied war effort. From the physicists who worked on projects such as the Manhattan Project to intellectuals who fought with the pen and the word, the Jews were present on all fronts of the war. In short, the history of the Jews in the Second World War is much more than the tragedy of the Holocaust. It is also the history of a people who resisted with weapons and with culture, who fought in the Allied armies, who helped to defeat Nazism, and who, even after the horror, found the strength to rebuild themselves. To tell what has never been told is to return to them their complete human dimension, not only as victims, but also as fighters, survivors, and protagonists of their own history. A people before the storm. Before the Second World War broke out in 1939, the life of the Jews in Europe was far from uniform. It was one of the oldest, most influential and diverse communities of the continent. For centuries, the Jews had been an integral part of European development, leaving their mark in fields such as the economy, science, politics, culture, and daily life. They were not an invisible or isolated minority, but a people with deep roots, who had managed to keep their traditions alive even after countless waves of persecutions and expulsions throughout history. In many European cities, Jewish life was vibrant and dynamic. Warsaw, for example, was known as the cultural capital of Judaism in Europe, with almost a third of its population of Jewish origin before the war. There, rabbis and traditional merchants lived alongside modern intellectuals, writers, journalists, and artists. The Yiddish language, spoken by millions of Jews in Eastern Europe, had given rise to a rich literature and a flourishing theatre, with packed halls and companies that toured different cities, bringing plays full of humour, social criticism, and traditions. At the same time, in cities like Berlin and Vienna, Jews were a fundamental part of the cosmopolitan and modern spirit of the interwar period. Doctors, lawyers, bankers, and academics who contributed innovation and critical thinking to society. Their internal diversity was one of the most notable features. While in Germany and France the majority of Jews were fully integrated and saw their identity mainly in terms of national citizenship, in places like Poland, Romania, or Lithuania, Judaism continued to be a form of community life. Their fairs, massive religious festivities, markets with strong Jewish presence were organized, and customs dating back to the Middle Ages were maintained. This duality generated, even within the Jewish people themselves, debates about assimilation, tradition, and the future of their identity. At the intellectual level, the Jewish presence was equally outstanding. It was no longer only extraordinary figures like Albert Einstein, who revolutionized physics, or Sigmund Freud, who opened new perspectives in psychology, but an entire generation of thinkers, doctors, engineers, writers, and musicians who were making their way in universities, academies, and cultural centers. The interwar period was especially fertile in this sense. Philosophers like Martin Buber and Franz Rosenzweig, writers like Stefan Zweig, or musicians like Arnold Schoenberg contributed to a cultural effervescence that marked all of Europe. In the political sphere, the Jews did not remain passive. They participated in all the great movements of the time. Zionism, which emerged at the end of the 19th century, had thousands of supporters in Eastern Europe, where many dreamed of the creation of a national home in Palestine. But there were also Jews committed to liberalism, socialism, or communism, convinced that the struggle for equality and social justice was the way to end centuries of anti-Semitism. In Russia and Poland, for example, there were Jewish political parties that defended cultural autonomy, Yiddish education, and the rights of the communities. Daily life was not disconnected from the great social changes of the time either. Many Jews emigrated to America, seeking better opportunities, while others moved from small towns to large cities in search of education and employment. That mobility favored the creation of international networks, both family and cultural, which would later be fundamental to maintaining bonds of solidarity in the years of persecution. Despite the progress, anti-Semitism never completely disappeared. In Central and Eastern Europe, Jews were often used as scapegoats in times of economic or political crisis. In countries like Romania, Hungary, or Poland, ultranationalist parties arose that promoted discriminatory laws and spread conspiracy theories about an alleged Jewish power. In Germany, even before the rise of Hitler, there were anti-Semitic movements that fed the idea that the Jews were responsible for the defeat in the First World War and for the crisis of the Weimar Republic. What is fascinating about this period is that, just on the threshold of the greatest catastrophe in their history, the Jewish people in Europe found themselves in a stage of intense creativity and transformation. Cultural life flourished, political debates were passionate, and communities, though diverse, maintained a strong sense of identity. In a way, that boom makes the tragedy that came shortly after even more heartbreaking. The destruction not only took away millions of lives, but also attempted to extinguish a cultural and social world that was in full development. But alongside that cultural richness, there also existed a persistent shadow that never completely faded, that of anti-Semitism. Although in countries like Germany, Austria, or France, many Jews felt integrated into the national fabric, with citizenship rights and a modern life, resentment and prejudice against them remained lurking in the entrails of European societies. It was a hostility that was not new, but that sank its roots into centuries of discrimination. Since the Middle Ages, Jews had been falsely accused in blood libels, blamed for epidemics like the Black Death, and expelled from entire kingdoms, from England in the 13th century to Spain in 1492. From time to time, that hostility rekindled in the form of violence, restrictive laws, or social segregation. With the arrival of modernity and the Enlightenment, many thought those prejudices would be left behind. The 19th century, with its ideals of citizenship and progress, brought advances. In several European countries, the Jews obtained legal equality, were able to enter universities, hold public office, and take part in cultural life as never before. However, anti-Semitism was transformed into something new. It was no longer only religious, but also political and pseudo-scientific. With the rise of nationalism in Europe, Jews began to be seen as perpetual foreigners, incapable of fully assimilating. In Germany and Austria, anti-Semitic parties arose that mixed traditional hostility with modern racial theories, describing the Jews as a distinct and inferior race. At the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, the so-called racial science and the writings of nationalist authors contributed to spreading the idea that the Jews were not simply a religious group, but a biological enemy for European nations. In Russia, the infamous Protocols of the Elders of Zion, a false document that described an alleged Jewish plan to dominate the world, spread quickly, fueling conspiracy theories that would later spread throughout Europe. That conspiratorial vision presented the Jews in a contradictory way, at the same time as bankers who controlled world capitalism and as communist agitators who wanted to destroy it. On the eve of the Second World War, about 9 million Jews lived in Europe, a significant population that extended from the Sephardim of the Mediterranean, heirs of Spanish and Ottoman traditions, to the millions of Ashkenazi Jews of Eastern Europe who lived in the famous shtetls. These small towns, located in Poland, Lithuania, Ukraine and Russia, were centers of community life marked by religious traditions, Yiddish as the everyday language and a strong sense of identity. But alongside them, there were fully integrated Jews in the most modern capitals of the continent, like Berlin, Paris, or Budapest, who dressed fashionably, wrote in the local newspapers, and thought in terms of progress and modernity. The paradox was evident. While Jews contributed decisively to the cultural, scientific, and economic development of Europe, giving the world doctors, engineers, philosophers, and artists, they also carried the weight of centuries of accumulated hatred. In many places, they were an inseparable part of urban life, owners of cafes, printing houses, bookstores, and workshops that gave life to the pulse of the city. Their newspapers were found in kiosks alongside the national dailies, and their universities trained new generations of professionals. And yet, in that same Europe, there were those who pointed to them as guilty of economic crises, of defeat in wars, or even of the moral decline of society. That world full of contrasts was about to be swept away. The rise of Nazism in Germany brought not only new discriminatory laws, but a political project that made the Jews the central enemy of humanity. With the invasion of Poland in 1939 and the outbreak of the war, latent hostility turned into systematic persecution. What had once been prejudice and propaganda became a deliberate plan to destroy not only people but an entire culture. The Europe that had once been home to millions of Jews, with its synagogues, its languages, its traditions, and its contributions, was entering the darkest stage of its history. Nazism not only sought to physically exterminate the Jews, but to erase their trace from European memory, to close their schools, burn their books, destroy their cemeteries, and wipe out the communities that for centuries had been an inseparable part of the continent. That Jewish life, so diverse and full of nuances, was about to disappear under the machinery of war and genocide of the Third Reich. Jewish life in interwar Europe. The First World War left a wounded continent marked by redrawn borders, convulsed societies, and faltering economies. In the midst of those ruins, European Jews faced a complex stage full of hopes and threats. Interwar Europe, between 1918 and 1939, was a time of intense political and social transformations. and the Jewish community was not alien to those contradictions. On the contrary, they experienced them with particular intensity. The collapse of the old empires, the Austro-Hungarian, the Tsarist, and the Ottoman, opened unprecedented opportunities. In theory, the new political map of Europe offered Jews a place as full citizens. In the peace treaties of Versailles and Saint-Germain, clauses were included that obligated the new states to guarantee the rights of minorities, among them the Jews. In the newly created Poland, in Czechoslovakia, or in Hungary, the constitutions granted citizenship, equality before the law, the right to vote, and access to public life. For many Jews, it was the first time that their belonging to the nation was legally supported and not subject to special privileges or partial concessions. In Germany, the Weimar Republic, 1919 to 1933, became a scene of unprecedented openness. There, Jewish intellectuals, scientists, and artists found fertile ground to develop. In Berlin, Jewish names were present in theater, cinema, philosophy, and science. From physicists such as Albert Einstein to filmmakers, composers, and writers, their cultural imprint defined much of the 1920s. The German capital, wounded but vibrant, was a cultural laboratory where the Jewish community actively participated in modernity. To the east of Europe, cities with a large Jewish presence such as Warsaw, Vilna, Lodz, or Lwów, today Lviv, experienced a cultural flourishing without precedent. Yiddish literature reached a golden age, with mass circulation newspapers, publishing houses, and theaters that kept alive a language shared by millions. Intellectuals such as Itzik Manger or Peretz Markish expressed the tensions of a world that oscillated between tradition and modernity. In Vilna, known as the Jerusalem of Lithuania, libraries, centers of Talmudic studies, and Jewish scientific societies were founded that sought to integrate the religious with the modern. In other capitals, such as Vienna and Budapest, Jews were protagonists in universities, literary cafes, and circles of artistic avant-garde. Jewish doctors, lawyers, musicians, and architects marked the rhythm of urban life. Their contributions were not limited to the cultural sphere. They were also present in commerce, the textile industry, and banking, vital sectors in the reconstruction of economies devastated by war. However, that progress coexisted with a dark reality. Anti-Semitism persisted, adopting new forms. Although legal equality seemed to guarantee a fairer future, in practice hostility toward Jews did not disappear. In the countryside and in the cities of Eastern Europe, ancestral prejudices intensified with the economic crisis and with the rise of nationalisms. Jews were singled out as foreigners in the newly formed nation-states, despite the fact that they had lived for generations and even centuries in those territories. In Poland and Romania, for example, pogroms, violent attacks against Jewish communities, continued in the 1920s and 1930s, sometimes with the complicity of local authorities. Universities in Warsaw, Krakow, or Bucharest introduced quotas to limit the access of Jewish students, while in the labor market discrimination was constant. In Romania, ultranationalist movements such as the Iron Guard promoted radical anti-Semitism mixed with religious fanaticism and paramilitary violence. The economic situation was not uniform either. While in the capitals many Jews prospered as entrepreneurs, merchants, bankers, doctors, or lawyers, millions in the East remained trapped in poverty. In the shtetls of Poland, Belarus, or Ukraine, most families depended on small workshops, artisan trades, or peddling. These contrasts fueled stereotypes. For the most nationalist sectors, the wealthy Jews of the cities represented a suspicious power, while the poor Jews of the countryside were seen as a burden or as intruders in a hostile rural world. The political instability of the time worsened these tensions. The Great Depression of 1929 hit Europe hard, leaving millions in misery and reviving the discourses that pointed to the Jews as guilty of the crisis. In that environment, anti-Semitism ceased to be only a social or cultural issue to become a central element of certain political projects. Far-right parties in Germany, Hungary, and Romania made hatred of the Jews a banner to attract frustrated masses. Thus, interwar Jewish Europe was a mosaic of contrasts: modernity and tradition, prosperity and poverty, integration and marginalization. It was a world full of vitality, but also vulnerable, situated at the crossroads of historical forces that would soon drag it toward an unprecedented catastrophe. The shtetls of Eastern Europe, with their muddy streets, bustling markets, and wooden houses, represented a way of life that had survived for centuries, despite the hostility of the surrounding environments. There, life revolved around religious festivities, education provided in the yeshivot, Talmudic schools, and traditions transmitted from generation to generation. Yiddish, the mother tongue of millions of Jews, was not only a means of communication, but also a cultural vehicle in which literary works, popular songs, and a shared sense of identity flourished. That culture, apparently apart from Western modernity, was not devoid of dynamism. Influential rabbis, Hasidic movements, and currents of enlightened thought coexisted in the same social space, shaping a community that was constantly reinventing itself. In the big cities, however, the panorama was very different. Berlin, for example, became the intellectual capital of the Jewish diaspora during the 1920s. Figures such as Albert Einstein, Walter Benjamin, or Hannah Arendt reflected the Jewish protagonism in science, philosophy, and political thought. In Vienna, the cafes were centers of debate where Jewish writers and psychoanalysts, among them Sigmund Freud and Stefan Zweig, set the cultural rhythm of an era in full effervescence. Budapest, for its part, gave the world Jewish mathematicians and musicians who left their mark on universal history. These contrasts between the traditional shtetls and the cosmopolitan circles of the metropolises showed the internal diversity of European Jewry, which could not be reduced to a single stereotype. In the political field, that plurality was equally evident. The Zionist movement expanded, driven by international congresses and by the growing support of communities that saw in Palestine not only a refuge, but a project of national regeneration. At the same time, many young Jews joined socialist unions, communist parties, or progressive movements that promised to tear down the barriers of discrimination through social revolution. In Poland, there were specifically Jewish parties, such as the Bund, which defended cultural autonomy and the maintenance of Yiddish as a living language, in opposition to those who advocated total assimilation into the majority culture. These internal tensions reflected a people who sought diverse answers to the same dilemma: how to ensure their survival on a continent where hostility never completely disappeared. The global economic crisis of 1929 sharpened the problem. In Eastern Europe, where much of the Jewish population lived from small businesses, crafts, or agricultural loans, the financial collapse meant ruin and misery. Merchants went bankrupt, markets emptied, and families could barely subsist. At the same time, in Western Europe, the most anti-Semitic sectors took advantage of the chaos to spread conspiracy theories. Jews were singled out as bankers who benefited from collective misfortune, or as agitators who promoted revolutions to destabilize states. Propaganda found fertile ground in societies punished by inflation, unemployment, and fear of the future. The German case was paradigmatic. After the humiliating Treaty of Versailles, many sought culprits for the defeat in the Great War. The Jews were presented as responsible for the stab in the back, a lie deliberately spread by ultra-nationalist sectors. With the arrival of Nazism, that discourse was institutionalized and became state policy, although it had already permeated different levels of society. The same happened in other countries. In Romania, the Iron Guard adopted a virulent anti-Semitism that led to pogroms and murders. In Poland, nationalist parties demanded the exclusion of Jews from universities and liberal professions. In Hungary, restrictive laws limited their access to economic life. In spite of everything, Jewish communities did not cease to contribute to the development of their nations. From the kibbutzim in Palestine, which inspired European youth with ideals of communal life, to the medical, artistic, and scientific innovations that arose in the capitals, the Jewish contribution was inseparable from the cultural advance of the continent. However, beneath that surface of achievements and creativity, a storm was brewing. The combination of economic crises, political radicalization, and propaganda of hate was preparing the ground for what would soon become systematic persecution. Interwar Jewish Europe was ultimately a vibrant but vulnerable universe, full of contradictions that would be brutally put to the test in the following years. Under Nazi persecution beyond the ghettos. When Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor in January of 1933, what began as a seemingly gradual process of exclusion turned into a systematic plan of destruction. From the very first months, the Nazi regime set in motion a legal and propagandistic framework aimed at tearing the Jews out of German public life. It was not only about removing them from state positions. Jewish lawyers were banned from practicing, doctors were expelled from hospitals, and Jewish writers or musicians were censored and marginalized from professional associations. Daily life began to close in on them. Bars, cinemas, spas, and even parks started to restrict their access. It was a gradual dispossession, carefully designed so that the Jews would be left isolated, turned into others within their own country. The role of propaganda was decisive. Joseph Goebbels, Minister of Propaganda, orchestrated a constant campaign in the press, cinema, and radio where Jews were presented as a biological, economic, and cultural threat. The public burning of books in 1933, where works by Jewish authors and thinkers considered degenerate went up in flames, was a warning that Nazism not only sought political domination, but also the erasure of the cultural memory of the Jewish people. In classrooms, children learned from an early age the racial science spread by the Nazis, convinced that anti-Semitism had to become part of everyday life. The Nuremberg laws of 1935 marked a before and after. It was not only about forbidding marriages and relations between Jews and Germans, but about establishing a hierarchical system where belonging to the German people was defined by blood. People with Jewish grandparents were classified as Mischlinge, mixed, trapped in a web of discrimination that closed educational, professional, and social opportunities for them. This legislation turned exclusion into official norm and prepared the ground for an ever more radical persecution. Violence, which at the beginning seemed limited to the legal and social sphere, soon took on a physical and brutal character. The Kristallnacht in November of 1938 was a preview of what was to come. Synagogues burned, businesses looted, and more than 30,000 Jews sent to concentration camps in a single night. It was the signal that the regime had decided to move from harassment to open repression. With the outbreak of the Second World War and the invasion of Poland in 1939, the persecution expanded and became part of the machinery of war. The ghettos created in Polish cities like Łódź, Krakow, and above all Warsaw turned into spaces of slow death. Hunger was so devastating that children crawled through sewers and crumbling walls to look for food on the Aryan side, risking their lives with each incursion. In Łódź, Jews were forced to work in improvised factories inside the ghetto, producing textiles and war material for the Germans in miserable conditions. The Nazi system, however, was not limited to the ghettos. Millions of Jews were deported to labor camps in Germany and in the occupied territories such as Majdanek, where in addition to producing for the military industry, they suffered brutal punishments, endless workdays, and arbitrary executions. The logic was clear. Squeeze labor power until the bodies were useless, then eliminate them. With Operation Barbarossa in 1941, the invasion of the Soviet Union opened an even darker chapter. The Einsatzgruppen, special SS units, roamed Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states with the explicit goal of murdering entire Jewish communities. These massacres were not improvised. They were organized with prior records, participation of local police, and collaboration of civil sectors. In Babi Yar, near Kiev, more than 33,000 Jews were murdered in just 2 days of September of 1941, shot in a meticulous operation. Similar scenes were repeated in hundreds of mass graves along the Eastern Front. What made this method of extermination even more terrifying was its public nature. These were not crimes hidden behind the walls of concentration camps, but executions in full view of the local population. The gunshots, the bodies, and the pits were known to all, but fear, collaboration, or indifference sealed the silence of much of the witnesses. Thus, by 1941 to 1942, the persecution had gone beyond any legal or social boundary. It was already a mass extermination combining ghettos, forced labor, shootings, and the preparation of the death camps. What began with laws and propaganda in 1933 had turned in less than a decade into one of the most systematic and planned genocides in human history. Beyond the walls of the ghettos and the mass executions, Nazism deployed a comprehensive strategy whose purpose was not only to eliminate lives, but to uproot at the root everything that represented Jewish existence in Europe. The policy of destruction was also directed against memory and against the symbols of collective identity. In cities like Berlin, Vienna, Prague, or Krakow, synagogues that had stood for centuries were reduced to rubble. In Warsaw, for example, the Great Synagogue was demolished in 1943 after the suppression of the ghetto uprising as a deliberate act to physically erase any cultural trace. Cemeteries, sacred spaces of the Jewish tradition, were desecrated, tombstones torn out, bones scattered, enclosures turned into warehouses or simple vacant lots. Community libraries and archives were looted or burned. Manuscripts in Hebrew and Yiddish, many of them unique, disappeared in flames along with centuries of spiritual and intellectual heritage. This process was not a spontaneous excess, but part of a cultural project of extermination. To the physical destruction of buildings was added the systematic theft of art, ritual objects, and community heritage, which were taken to Nazi museums or private collections. The Institute for the Study of the Jewish Question in Frankfurt came to store thousands of confiscated volumes with the idea of using them as testimony of a people destined to disappear. In other words, the Nazis sought not only to murder bodies, but to turn the Jewish people into a dead relic, studied only as a vestige of an extinct past. Propaganda, carefully designed, was another central tool of this total persecution. Publications such as the weekly Der Stürmer, directed by Julius Streicher, constantly fed popular hatred with grotesque caricatures and conspiracy theories. Posters in streets and train stations depicted Jews as plague, invaders, or conspirators, reinforcing the idea that they were invisible enemies contaminating the nation. In cinema, productions such as The Eternal Jew, 1940, presented Jews as social parasites, justifying segregation and violence. The constant repetition of these dehumanizing images allowed exclusionary policies, and later extermination ones, to be perceived by many citizens as inevitable or even necessary. In the midst of this oppressive machinery, Jewish communities tried to sustain their cultural and spiritual life even in extreme conditions. In the ghettos, where death lurked every day, clandestine schools were organized so that children could continue learning despite the prohibition of formal education. Teachers taught in basements or behind walls, risking their lives to transmit knowledge of mathematics, literature, or religion. Hidden libraries gathered books rescued from ruins as a symbol of resistance against barbarism. Resistance also took on a political and armed character. In Warsaw, Vilna and Białystok youth organizations emerged that began to plan uprisings, convinced that if they were going to die, they would do so fighting. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in April of 1943 was the most dramatic example. Men and women poorly armed, many with only pistols and Molotov cocktails, faced German troops for weeks as they tried to liquidate the ghetto. Although the insurrection ended in a massacre, it became a symbol of dignity in the face of extermination. No less important was the spiritual resistance. In ghettos and camps, rabbis continued to celebrate rituals in secret. Marriages were officiated under the shadow of repression, and even in the darkest moments there were those who wrote diaries or poems preserving the memory of what was happening. These forms of resistance, although they did not stop the Nazi machinery, represented a moral triumph, the will not to allow Jewish identity to be completely destroyed. Nazi persecution against the Jews, therefore, was much broader than the images of hunger and overcrowding in the ghettos show. It was a system that sought to annihilate simultaneously physical life and cultural legacy, a siege that stifled the political, the economic, the social, the spiritual, and the symbolic. Taken together, these measures were the prelude to the most radical and definitive phase, the final solution, in which destruction ceased to be partial or fragmented and was transformed into an industrialized and systematic extermination. Jews in armed resistance. When one thinks of the Jews during the Second World War, the image of defenselessness usually prevails. Crowds deported in cattle wagons, endless lines toward the gas chambers, exhausted faces behind the walls of the ghettos. But that vision, although real, does not tell the whole story. Alongside suffering, there was also struggle, a resistance that took many forms and that, against all odds, stood up to Nazism even in the most hostile scenarios. The history of that resistance, often forgotten or minimized, reveals that not all resignedly accepted the fate that was imposed on them. The uprising of the Warsaw ghetto in April of 1943 is perhaps the best-known symbol of this spirit. Young people from Jewish youth organizations, many barely in their 20s, decided that their last word would not be passivity. The Jewish Combat Organization, JOB, together with the rival group SZW, Jewish Military Union, secretly collected weapons, dug tunnels, and planned ambushes. With minimal resources, pistols, old rifles, and Molotov cocktails made from glass bottles, they resisted for almost a month against the German troops that tried to liquidate the ghetto. The uprising was crushed with brutality. The Nazis set fire to building after building and reduced the ghetto to ruins. But in symbolic terms, the struggle transcended. It was an affirmation of dignity in the midst of extermination and a message to the world. The Jews did not let themselves be dragged simply toward death. Warsaw, however, was not an isolated case. In other ghettos, rebellions also broke out, although on a smaller scale. In Vilna, young people of the Vereinigte Partisaner Organisatie, United Partisan Organization, tried to provoke an insurrection in 1943, although they were betrayed and many died in combat. In Białystok that same year, hundreds of Jewish fighters took up arms in a desperate struggle against the German forces, knowing beforehand that defeat was inevitable. Even in smaller ghettos, such as Częstochowa, uprisings were repeated. The idea of fighting until the end spread like a spark that refused to go out. Outside the ghettos, the forests and mountains of Eastern Europe became refuge and battlefield. Thousands of Jews escaped to those areas to join the partisans, guerrillas who harassed the German forces with ambushes and sabotage. One of the most extraordinary cases was that of the Bielski brothers in Belarus. They not only formed a combat unit, but also built a true settlement in the middle of the thicket with workshops, bakeries, and clandestine schools. Their priority was not only to kill enemies, but to save lives. Elderly people, women, and children were welcomed in that refuge that came to gather more than 1,200 people. In the midst of terror, they managed to preserve life and even a form of organized community, something that seemed impossible in those circumstances. In the Soviet Union, Jews were an essential part of the partisan brigades. They fought in Belarus, Ukraine, and Lithuania, many times in command of entire detachments. Their participation was so significant that in some regions the Nazis launched large-scale military operations only to try to eradicate these forces. And even so, the partisans managed to blow up trains, destroy bridges, cut supply lines, and put in check an apparently invincible army. In Western Europe, Jewish resistance also manifested itself with strength. In France, the Armée Juive dedicated itself to sabotage, rescue of children, and selective attacks against collaborators and Nazi officers. Young Jews participated in the resistance shoulder to shoulder with French fighters, delivering information, distributing clandestine press, and risking their lives in guerrilla operations. In Belgium, groups of Jews managed to stop a deportation train in 1943, freeing hundreds of prisoners in an unprecedented action. In Italy and Yugoslavia, Jews joined the local partisan forces, contributing to a broader struggle against fascism. This resistance was not only armed. There was also a silent struggle, less visible but equally heroic. Those who forged documents to save others, those who hid children in Catholic orphanages, those who taught in clandestine schools or kept religious traditions alive in secret. Each act of dignity, each effort to protect a life or to keep cultural memory alive was in itself an act of resistance against the Nazi attempt to annihilate the Jewish people in its entirety. The image of defenseless victims is real, but incomplete. There were thousands who, even knowing that the chances of survival were minimal, chose to fight, to rescue, to protect, or to preserve. The Jewish resistance, although often forgotten in collective memory, showed that even in the darkest scenarios, the will to fight for life and dignity never disappeared. Resistance was not always armed in the classic sense. Many Jews participated in clandestine networks that forged documents, hid the persecuted or sabotaged German production from inside factories. Each act of defiance, from smuggling bread in the ghettos to printing clandestine newspapers, was also a form of resistance against the Nazi attempt to dehumanize them. It is important to understand that for the Jews, to resist did not mean only to fight the enemy, but to affirm their right to exist. In a context where extermination was the final goal of Nazism, raising a weapon, hiding a child, or keeping a tradition alive was an act of heroism. Although official history for a long time minimized these episodes, the truth is that there was Jewish resistance in almost every place where persecution existed. Not all could fight, but those who did showed that even in the most desperate circumstances there was room for dignity, courage, and rebellion. The image of the Jew as a passive victim was engraved by the horror of the Holocaust. But what must never be forgotten is that there were also Jews who resisted, fought, and made it clear that their history is not only one of suffering, but also of struggle and courage. Jews in the Allied armies. When analyzing Jewish participation in the Allied armies, one discovers a much greater contribution than what is usually shown in the general historical narrative. On almost every front of the war, there were Jewish fighters who, far from being mere witnesses or victims, became active protagonists in the defeat of Nazism. In the case of the Soviet Union, the figure of more than 500,000 Jews in the Red Army shows absolute commitment. Many were peasants, workers, or students who, when the German invasion began in 1941, did not hesitate to join the defense of their land. Some distinguished themselves notably. General Lev Dovato, cavalry commander, was famous for his charges against German troops, or the sniper Vasily Zaitsev, although better known as a Soviet symbol, shared the ranks with numerous Jewish sharpshooters trained to eliminate enemy officers and spread terror among the occupation troops. There were also heroes in military medicine, such as Dr. Boris Shapiro, who saved countless lives in precarious conditions on the Eastern Front. The dedication was so great that about 40% of the Soviet Jews who fought died in the war, a devastating proportion that shows the magnitude of their sacrifice. In the United States, Jewish participation was not only numerically significant, but also symbolic. Many young American Jews, most of them from humble neighborhoods in New York, Chicago, or Philadelphia, enlisted motivated by the desire to stop Nazi barbarism. A notable example is Sergeant Isidor Yuckman, who received the posthumous Medal of Honor for bravely stopping the advance of German tanks in Belgium. Jewish doctors and chaplains also distinguished themselves by offering spiritual and material aid to soldiers of all faiths. The experience of these fighters was marked by a double struggle, on the battlefield against the enemy and in memory, knowing that their relatives in Europe were being persecuted or exterminated. In Great Britain and the British Empire, the contribution was equally relevant. Thousands of British Jews served in the Royal Air Force, the Navy, and the Army. Some participated in aerial defense during the Battle of Britain, fighting in the skies against the Luftwaffe. But without a doubt, the creation of the Jewish Brigade in 1944 was a historic event. Composed of about 5,000 volunteers from the British Mandate of Palestine, it became the first official Jewish unit to participate as an independent military body since antiquity. They fought bravely in Italy and, after the German surrender, dedicated themselves to helping Holocaust survivors, guiding them through clandestine routes to Palestine in what became known as the Aliyah Bet. For many historians, this military experience strengthened the confidence and preparation that a few years later would be vital in Israel's War of Independence in 1948. Other countries were not left out. In Canada, around 17,000 Jews fought on the European fronts, distinguishing themselves in Normandy and in the Dutch campaign. In Australia, about 7,000 served both in Europe and in Asia, facing the Japanese in the Pacific. In South Africa, the Jewish community also contributed thousands of men to the troops that fought in North Africa and Italy. Jewish participation in the French resistance deserves special mention. There, Jewish fighters were not only part of guerrilla cells, but also actively participated in sabotaging railways, attacking German convoys, and rescuing persecuted children. Organizations such as the Mouvement de la Jeunesse Sioniste or the Armée Juive were fundamental in clandestine operations. After the liberation of France, many of these fighters joined the regular army, continuing the fight until the final defeat of the Reich. What is most relevant in this panorama is that, although it was a collective effort alongside other peoples, for the Jews, the war had a profoundly personal character. They fought not only for the freedom of their countries of adoption, but for the survival of their own people. For many, each battle won represented a blow against a regime that had condemned their parents, siblings, or children to death. Their contribution cannot be reduced to figures. It was a contribution marked by pain, by courage, and by the certainty that this was a war of life or death. The struggle was indeed military and existential at the same time. For Jewish soldiers, each confrontation on the front carried an emotional weight impossible to describe. It was not only about fulfilling a patriotic duty toward the United States, the Soviet Union, Great Britain, or any other allied nation. It was also about responding to the attempt to totally annihilate their people. This double dimension gave their participation a unique character. They fought for the military victory of the Allies, but also for the very survival of Jewish identity. The symbolic burden reached its most powerful point in 1945, when Allied units, which included among their ranks thousands of Jewish fighters, participated in the liberation of the concentration camps. In places such as Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, or Buchenwald, soldiers of Jewish origin witnessed what until then they had only heard in rumors: mountains of corpses, skeletal prisoners who could barely stand, ovens and gas chambers. For them, entering those camps meant not only fulfilling a military mission, but facing the materialization of the horror that had haunted their families. Some even came to liberate relatives or acquaintances, a fact that gave that moment a heartbreaking and unforgettable character. The presence of Jewish fighters in these scenes was an act of historical justice. The people Hitler had wanted to erase were present at the moment of his final defeat. However, despite this relevance, the official post-war narratives tended to make that contribution invisible. History textbooks, films of the time, and commemorative speeches focused on the glory of great generals and the power of national armies, but rarely emphasized that among those soldiers there were Jews who fought with a profoundly different motivation. This omission was not accidental. In many countries, anti-Semitism remained latent and, moreover, the Allied nations preferred to highlight their own collective protagonism rather than give space to particular memories. Even so, personal testimonies have allowed that part of history to be rescued. Many Jewish veterans wrote memoirs, told their experiences to their descendants, or donated their archives to museums and foundations. Thanks to those voices, we now know that there were Jewish doctors caring for liberated prisoners in Dachau, Jewish pilots bombing German factories, and Jewish chaplains organizing religious services in the ruins of Europe for the survivors. These accounts reveal a double legacy: the tangible military contribution and the reaffirmation that Jewish identity had resisted extermination. Recognition came slowly. Decades after the war, some governments began to pay tribute to Jewish fighters. In Israel, the memory of the Jewish Brigade became a symbol of pride and resistance. In the United States and Europe, Jewish veterans associations gained visibility, claiming a place in official history. And in the Soviet Union, despite state censorship, many families privately preserved the decorations and stories of Jewish fathers or grandfathers who had served in the Red Army. Today, looking back, it is clear that the role of the Jews in the Allied armies was inseparable from the outcome of the war. Their sacrifice, their deaths on the front, and their presence in the final victory disprove the reduced image of a people only as victims. They were also active fighters, soldiers on the front line, men and women who gave their lives to a cause that, beyond the political or the military, was that of all humanity. Remembering this legacy is essential because in their stories beats not only the triumph over Nazism, but also the demonstration that Jewish identity was not broken, but rose again with greater strength by contributing directly to the downfall of the Third Reich. From horror to the reconstruction of a people, the reconstruction of the Jewish people was not only physical or political, it was also spiritual, cultural, and deeply emotional. The survivors of the Shoah carried with them invisible scars, the trauma of persecution, the guilt of having survived when so many others had perished, and the unfathomable void of entire families that had been annihilated. In many cases, the survivors faced the impossibility of recounting what they had lived through. The outside world found it difficult to understand, and even to believe the magnitude of the horror. It was not uncommon for many to remain silent for years, unable to put into words what they had witnessed. Even so, little by little, Jewish life began to resurge from the ashes. In the displaced persons camps, in addition to schools and community committees, marriages flourished and thousands of children were born, later known as the first generation of rebirth. These births symbolized an act of resistance against Hitler, the continuity of the people who had been targeted for extermination. In some of those camps, such as Bergen-Belsen, transformed into a displaced persons center, religious celebrations, Jewish music festivals, and even sports teams were organized, demonstrating that community life found ways to be reborn in the most adverse conditions. In Palestine, Jewish migration was massive, although largely clandestine, since the British authorities maintained strict quotas. Organizations such as the Haganah and more radical groups such as the Irgun organized illegal ships that transported survivors from Europe to the coasts of Palestine. Many of these journeys were intercepted and the passengers sent to detention camps in Cyprus, but international pressure grew. The fresh memory of the Holocaust meant that finally the Zionist cause obtained unprecedented support in the international community. The creation of the State of Israel in 1948 was seen by much of the Jewish people as a historic victory, the rebirth of a homeland after the darkest tragedy in its history. Meanwhile, in the diaspora, the Jews who emigrated to North and South America found new spaces to rebuild their lives. In the United States and Canada, Jewish communities absorbed the newcomers, who quickly integrated into economic and cultural life. In Latin America, countries such as Argentina, Brazil, and Mexico received tens of thousands of survivors who enriched the social fabric with their traditions, their work, and their memory. In all those places, reconstruction implied a delicate balance between integrating into the new society and preserving the memory of what had been lost. The pursuit of justice, although partial, was another central component of the post-war years. The Nuremberg trials set a precedent, but there also arose processes in different European countries against lower-ranking Nazi criminals. Even so, many culprits managed to escape. Some fled to Latin America, where they found refuge with false identities. However, the memory of the victims was a driving force that decades later pushed the judicial pursuit of figures such as Adolf Eichmann, captured by the Mossad in Argentina in 1960 and tried in Jerusalem. These trials were not only legal acts, but also pedagogical ones. They showed the world with irrefutable evidence the magnitude of the genocide. In the cultural and spiritual field, the reconstruction was also notable. Jewish writers and thinkers began to set down in books, memoirs, and diaries the experiences they had lived. Works such as those of Primo Levi, Elie Wiesel, or Anne Frank, although each with its particular tone, became pillars of collective memory. Yiddish songs, recovered religious rituals, and the teaching of the history of the Holocaust were transformed into mechanisms to preserve identity in the face of the risk of forgetting. In short, the post-war period was not only a process of material recomposition, but also a struggle to keep memory alive. The Jewish people, struck as no other by the Second World War, found the strength to reinvent themselves, to claim justice, and to transmit to future generations a teaching that transcended the particular, that silence and indifference are accomplices of horror. The Jewish reconstruction after 1945 was in itself an act of resistance and an affirmation of life, a response to the attempt to erase them from history. Jewish writers, poets, and philosophers began to bear witness to the horror lived so that the world would never forget. Works such as those of Primo Levi or Elie Wiesel became beacons of memory. In Israel, founded in 1948, the Shoah became a central element of national identity. The memory of the fallen and the experience of collective suffering were transformed into the foundation of a new consciousness of unity. From the horror of the Holocaust arose then a paradox. The Nazi attempt to erase the Jewish people from the face of the earth ended up reinforcing their determination to survive and to rebuild. From the ashes of Auschwitz and Treblinka was born a new chapter in Jewish history, painful but also full of resilience. The path was neither easy nor immediate. Poverty, psychological traumas, and loss marked an entire generation. But the fact that, just a few years later, the Jews had rebuilt living communities throughout the world, founded a state, and established institutions dedicated to memory and justice, demonstrates an unbreakable truth. The people whom Hitler tried to exterminate not only survived, but resurfaced with greater strength. The forgotten legacy of the Jews in the Second World War. When speaking of the Second World War, the image that usually dominates is that of the Holocaust. The concentration camps, the gas chambers, the trains packed toward death. And it is logical because it was a crime without precedent in human history. However, that vision, though essential, has ended up overshadowing another equally fundamental aspect: the legacy of the Jews during the conflict, a legacy of struggle, innovation, culture and resilience that rarely appears in the most widespread accounts. Millions of Jews were victims of systematic extermination, but at the same time there were thousands who played an active and decisive role in the war. In the Red Army, more than 500,000 Jews fought in crucial battles such as Moscow, Stalingrad and Kursk, not a few reaching the highest military ranks. Some commanded entire divisions and dozens received the decoration of Hero of the Soviet Union, the highest military honor. In the United States, around 550,000 Jews wore the uniform and participated in campaigns ranging from Normandy to the Pacific, occupying positions as intelligence officers, field doctors, engineers, and pilots. In Great Britain, about 100,000 Jews served in the armed forces, including the thousands of volunteers from the British Mandate of Palestine, who formed the Jewish Brigade that fought in Italy under the banner of the Star of David. These men and women were not only fighting against an external enemy, but against the very regime that had condemned their families and communities to death. The Jewish contribution was also decisive in the field of science and technology. Albert Einstein, exiled in the United States after fleeing Nazi persecution, became a moral and scientific reference whose letter to Roosevelt in 1939 was fundamental in pushing forward the Manhattan Project. Jewish scientists such as Leo Szilard, Edward Teller, or Niels Bohr, although the latter was not a practicing Jew, played key roles in the development of nuclear energy, whose impact marked not only the end of the war, but the course of world geopolitics. In parallel, Jewish doctors and chemists contributed to advances in antibiotics, blood transfusions, and medical treatments that saved countless lives on the fronts. Even in cryptography, figures of Jewish origin participated in Allied teams that deciphered military codes, thus weakening the ability of the Nazis to coordinate their war machinery. The clandestine resistance was not without Jewish presence either. In the ghettos of Warsaw, Vilna or Białystok, young people armed with Molotov cocktails, hidden pistols, and iron determination challenged the German army in uprisings that, although crushed with violence, became universal symbols of dignity in the face of oppression. In the forests of Belarus and Lithuania, Jewish partisans fought as guerrillas, destroying supply lines, attacking Nazi convoys, and protecting thousands of refugees. The story of the Bielski brothers, who managed to save more than 1,200 people by creating a hidden settlement in the forest, is just one example of the breadth and courage of this resistance. To all this is added the cultural and intellectual role. Writers, musicians, and Jewish artists who managed to survive persecution kept alive the identity of their people through diaries, poems, songs in Yiddish, and clandestine theatrical works in the midst of the ghettos. Their legacy was not only an act of spiritual resistance against the attempted dehumanization, but also left an invaluable testimony of what it meant to cling to life and dignity in the midst of horror. The problem is that after the war, the official narrative tended to relegate these contributions to the background. There was talk of the victorious nations, of the generals and battles, but rarely was it mentioned that in those same ranks there were thousands of Jews fighting with a profoundly personal motivation. For decades, the Jew was reduced almost exclusively to the image of a passive victim, when in reality he was also soldier, scientist, guerrilla, and creator. Only in recent times have historiography and public memory begun to recover this forgotten dimension, giving back to the Jewish people the place they truly occupied in the defeat of Nazism and in the reconstruction of the world after barbarism. The legacy is also cultural and human. Even in the midst of persecution, the Jews made a titanic effort to keep their traditions alive, as if the simple act of studying, singing, or writing were an act of defiance against the attempt to annihilate them. In the ghettos, where hunger, overcrowding, and the threat of deportation were the norm, clandestine schools emerged where teachers taught children who at any moment could be snatched away by raids. Those teachers not only transmitted knowledge of mathematics or literature, but also instilled hope and a cultural continuity that Nazism sought to destroy. In Warsaw, Vilna, or Łódź, theatrical performances were organized and songs in Yiddish were written that, despite being surrounded by walls and barbed wire, gave voice to a people that refused to be reduced to silence. The clandestine diaries, such as that of Emanuel Ringelblum and his secret archive in Warsaw known as Oneg Shabbat, documented daily life, the atrocities suffered, and the forms of spiritual and cultural resistance. These writings, buried in metal boxes and discovered after the war, are today one of the most valuable testimonies of that time, for they show not only suffering, but also the will to leave a record for future generations. To resist was not only to take up a rifle or make a Molotov cocktail. To resist was to continue writing poems in the darkness of a basement, was to sing songs that kept the Yiddish language alive, was to pray in secret, was to share a piece of bread among five. Culture became a refuge, an invisible shield against dehumanization, and in many cases it was what allowed communities to maintain their dignity in the face of the systematic attempt to erase them from history. Why was this legacy forgotten for so long? The answer is complex and marked by several layers of silence. First, because the collective trauma of the Holocaust was so overwhelming that it overshadowed everything else. 6 million truncated lives generated such a deep wound that the narrative of destruction absorbed the memory of creation and resistance. Second, because the victorious states of the war directed their memory toward great military triumphs. The landing in Normandy, the Battle of Stalingrad, the fall of Berlin. In that narrative, Jews appeared almost always as victims liberated from the camps, not as active actors of their own destiny. And third, because in many European countries it was uncomfortable to remember local collaboration with the Nazis, everyday anti-Semitism, denunciations, police forces that participated in raids. It was easier to reduce Jews to the silence of martyrdom than to recognize that they had also fought, that they had had a voice, that they had demanded justice. However, in recent decades, a process of recovering these memories has begun. Historians, survivors, and descendants have worked tirelessly to recover the names of those Jewish fighters in the Allied armies, of the guerrillas in the forests, of the teachers in the ghettos, of the scientists who changed the course of the war. Diaries have been published, museums have been built, films and documentaries have been made that show a more complete image, where the Jew is not only the passive victim of barbarism, but also the creator, the thinker, the fighter, and the guardian of his culture. This change of perspective is not minor, recognizing that the Jews were not only objects of genocide, but also subjects of resistance. changes the way we understand not only the Second World War, but also the capacity of the human being to face horror. It reminds us that struggle does not always take the form of armed violence, that sometimes the deepest resistance is to keep the flame of identity burning, even when everything around conspires to extinguish it. The forgotten legacy of the Jews in the Second World War is not only part of Jewish history, it is the heritage of all humanity. It speaks of the capacity of the human spirit not to surrender, even under the most extreme conditions. It shows us that, in the midst of hell, there were those who preserved the light, and that this light continues to shine in collective memory, in culture transmitted from generation to generation, and in the very existence of a people that refused to disappear. This legacy is a universal lesson, that culture, memory, and dignity can be weapons as powerful as an army, and that remembering those who refuse to be reduced to silence is a way of defeating, still today, those who tried to erase them from history. What was never fully told about the Jews during the Second World War is that their story is not reduced to the train cars, the gas chambers, or the piles of shoes in the concentration camps. That is an essential part, yes, but it is not the only one. There was a people who, even in the face of extermination, fought to survive, to preserve their culture, to keep hope alive. There were Jewish soldiers on the battlefronts, partisans in the forests, scientists in laboratories, teachers in the ghettos, and artists who continued creating when it seemed impossible. Their legacy was silenced for decades. But today, we know that the Second World War cannot be fully understood without recognizing that other face, that of the Jew as an active protagonist of history, as fighter, as thinker, and as creator. To understand it obliges us to look beyond the image of the passive victim and to recognize the dignity of those who resisted in every possible way. That is the true legacy. The certainty that identity, memory, and the will to live can challenge even the greatest project of destruction ever conceived. To remember it is not only an act of justice toward the Jewish people, it is also a universal reminder that even in the darkest times, humanity can rise and keep the light alive.